Hey everybody, Stacey here with New Creations by Stacey. Before we get started, please hit that subscribe button. For the first layer on our mixed media canvas, we're going to be using the Sapphire Wings decoupage paper. I'm using an art brush and a little bit of water to trace out where I want to tear the paper. That just allows it to tear more easily exactly where you want it and not have any mistakes. My favorite medium for decoupage is the Redesign with Prima decoupage gel, and I'm using it in matte here. It also comes in shine. I also like to decoupage in smaller sections. I just find that it's easier to get all of the wrinkles out. So once I apply the decoupage gel to a small section, I'm just laying that down, wiping a little balled up piece of saran wrap over it to get all the air bubbles out, and then going back over it with the decoupage gel to ensure it has a nice adherence. In addition to that, a torn edge is easier to blend in than the straight edges, and that's why I did not use scissors here. If you do get any wrinkles, about an hour or two after the decoupage, the last coat of decoupage gel has been applied, you can go ahead and put a piece of parchment paper down, use a hot iron, and just iron over that parchment paper to eliminate those wrinkles. Once the gel dried, which took just a few hours, I came back in with a premium chip brush and started to blend in around the edges. I'm mainly using a stippling motion, and I'm using In the Navy, Bunker Hill Blue, Peacock, Vintage Duck Egg, and then Antique Gold. All but the Antique Gold are Dixie Belle Paint Company products. The Antique Gold paint that I'm using here is by Paint Couture. I did not add any water to my paint or anything else because I do need it to be a little bit thick. That's also why I'm using that stippling motion to kind of cover up the edges where I'm blending that decoupage paper into the canvas. I am stippling directly with the bristle tips, but I'm also, if you notice, laying my paintbrush down and kind of adding just a little bit of paint sprinkles here and there using the side of my brush. As I'm getting closer to the birds and putting the paint there, I'm using a baby wipe to kind of wipe back just a little bit. That also makes my paint a bit transparent. It allows the decoupage paper in that portion to show through a tad bit, and that also helps the transition from the paint to the decoupage paper. In addition, I'm using just a few art brushes when I'm going around those areas because I am bringing the paint in really close to the birds and the flowers. Once this first layer dried, I did come in very lightly with the second layer, some synthetic brushes, as well as a sea sponge to go ahead and just kind of touch up that background. The decoupage paper has some dark brown crackle in the background, and I wanted to match that on the canvas here. So I'm using the Imperial Crackle stamp by Redesign with Prima, and I just rolled some coffee bean over the stamp and then applied it to the canvas. Here you can see a close-up of how well that turned out and how well it matches the original background on the decoupage paper itself. At this point, I wanted to add a little bit more detail, so I'm using coffee bean, and I'm doing a dry brush with a synthetic chip brush. I just loaded up my paintbrush with paint, wiped it all off onto the lint-free paper towel, and then went around the edges. I laid my brush down in some places and drug the paint on in other places. I did do a very light sweep in so that I could get a little more definition and detail there. Now that I have the background painted in and I've added the crackle, I'm going to go ahead and touch up the flowers. And one key piece of information whenever you are blending in decoupage paper, it is really good to not only paint in the area that you're painting in, but then tape that same color paint and kind of go over the details in the flowers that are already painted onto the decoupage paper. This just helps make it like one cohesive picture. Of course, I'm using a fine tip art brush to apply the paint, and I'm only using 3 or 4 colors here. I used magnolia as well as the coffee bean for the center of the flowers, and then to blend out a little bit. There are some grays in the flowers, but this coffee bean it's a very dark brown, but it has a black base. So when you mix a lighter color in, it does tend to bring out the grays. So it was perfect for blending in these flowers. And then I also used a little bit of briar patch for the leaves. Again, I created the shading on the leaves as well as the flowers with just these few colors. I lightened up that briar patch with the magnolia. I tend to skip around a little bit as I'm painting these flowers. This is a very quick drying paint. So as I go and skip around, I can come back to that original flower. I can add layers. And then, of course, I stay on the same flower if I'm wanting to kind of blend in a little bit to create that depth and detail. Again, I am keeping the paint very thick on my brush because I'm going over that line where the decoupage paper is and onto the canvas, and I want to ensure that is covered up, so I do want a little bit of texture here. Unfortunately, as I was finishing up these flowers, I ended up getting in between the camera and the canvas, so you cannot actually see the final touches on the flowers. I did also paint in the stamp on the top left there, and of course I used Anchor in silk paint to do that. I did paint in the sides of the canvas as well. For the final touch, I decided to go ahead and add in some script transfers in antique gold as well as black. Since these are scraps, I'm not quite sure what all of the transfers are that I used, but part of it is, let's see, Lovely Ledger. I use Sweet Notes. That's one of the gold script transfers, as well as Vintage Script, which is the last black transfer here that I'm using right now. In addition, the black was a little bit different than the script that was on the decoupage paper. So I did go ahead and use Anchor in silk and a script brush to go ahead and line out some of those letters so it darkened them up and they matched the transfer a little bit better. If you like this video, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you'll be alerted for more video drops. I did apply the transfers directly onto the paint. I did not protect until after this was done, and I did apply 2 coats of Clear Coat by Dixie Belle in flat. Since the canvas is not exactly solid, I'm actually placing my hand behind the canvas as I'm rubbing down. In addition to that, I'm using the corner of the stick that comes with the transfers to kind of rub it down without pushing too hard onto the canvas. When I'm working on a smaller canvas, I actually like to lay it down and put a book behind it so it applies just like it would to furniture. But in this case, it was a 30 by 30 canvas, and it just really wasn't convenient to do it while it was laying flat. The products that I'm using can be found on my website at www.newcreationsbystacey.com. If you are local, I do have 2 store locations as well. There's the Rustic Willow in Ardmore, Alabama, and then University Pickers in Huntsville, Alabama.